Hello and welcome to NewsClick. At the recent Science Congress, the Prime Minister has announced a new policy on science, technology and innovation. To discuss this, we have with us today Dr. Satyajit Rath from the National Institute of Immunology. Welcome, Satyajit.
Thank you.
This is the fourth policy on science and technology. From the first science policy resolution, then the technology policy statement, and the S&T policy, and this is the fourth, taking us presumably to the next step up and talking about the innovation policy. What is your overall view of the direction and thrust given in this policy statement?
Before we talk about the contents of the policy, let us get one thing out of the way. Policies are really symbolic statements. By and large, the promise of a policy is not commensurate with the performance under that policy. We are always underperforming. Now, one can say, so we are trying our best, that is why we are setting ourselves high standards, and even if we fall short, we are struggling for that. This is a reasonable position. What is missing, not simply in this policy, but in most policies, is an appraisal of the causes of underperformance of previous policies in this matter. This policy has exactly the same problem. There are really no indications of what the level of underperformance was in previous policies in the S&T sector and what the possible causes could be. This is not a matter of assigning blame. This is a matter of trying to identify causes for underperformance that are addressable. Not doing that does public policy a disservice. This policy is no exception.
So essentially what you're saying is that if you have set yourself some targets today, you should know reasons why you would or would not be able to achieve those targets that you have set. What are the kinds of structural impediments that you may be suffering from, institutional bottlenecks. So while announcing a policy, one should also be looking at implementation issues and seeing what the challenges could be at that level.
Absolutely. And it is experience which will teach us this, and therefore a policy in one domain should look at previous policy performance and try to identify from an appraisal of the degree of underperformance and the causes of underperformance, whether, as you say, structural improvements, solutions, approaches, strategies can be put in place in this. In the absence of that, it becomes an exercise in Mungerilal's dreams.
I think several scholarly articles in the past have spoken about problems in institutional structures in Indian science. And in terms of whether it is pursuit of basic research or pursuit of technology, or as is now being talked about, converting science and technology into innovations, surely there are major institutional challenges that India needs to overcome in terms of its scientific and technological infrastructure.
Absolutely. In fact, there is no question that we do have institutional, organizational, structural limitations. Be it noted, as far as I am concerned, we have problems that are independent of this. We have problems of human resource capacity and a host of related issues. But certainly we have structural difficulties. As a matter of fact, this document does acknowledge, at least tacitly, some of those structural difficulties. My problem is that that acknowledgement stands as an isolated independent exercise, not connecting to a cause and effect appraisal of previous policy performances, and therefore it becomes much more of a coffee table conversation of lamentations about structural limitations converted into a policy.
Let me turn to a few specifics in terms of the targets this policy sets for itself. The policy talks of increasing research expenditure as a percentage of GDP, going up from the present rather lamentable 1% to something close to 2% of GDP, but primarily says that this rise from 1 to 2% would be achieved by getting the private sector to increase its expenditure from the present 1/3 ratio to roughly equal to that of the state. What do you think about this direction that the policy gives?
Let me answer that at two levels. The first level connects to what we were saying earlier, that commitments to increase not simply quality but even capacity at these kinds of rates is almost always impossible. There is just no way for an extremely basic level enterprise to pull itself up by its socks into the stratosphere. It can do a certain amount of pulling up, but you cannot suddenly create, for example, 100 new universities and staff them appropriately in a matter of months. The first level of difficulty with these claims is exactly the same. The proportionate increments, either in human resource or in funding absorption, you see, assignment of funds is one thing, but the system to be able to absorb those funds and use them meaningfully itself is yet another major bottleneck. So none of this is likely to happen. So that promising these things without any realistic likelihood that they will happen is a bit of smoke and mirrors. At the second level, to bypass this structural worry by saying we'll invite the private sector into this, and the private sector, because it is not constrained structurally as the public sector is constrained, will suddenly explode. The private sector does not explode either.
The private sector in India has had no big record of expenditure in R&D.
In this kind of stuff.
And is there any reason to believe that
it will suddenly go from an extremely flat rate of growth into an accelerating rate of growth? There is no reason to believe this. So even as far as the private sector invitation is concerned, it's not clear that hopes will be lived up to. But there is a bigger problem for me with regard to the structural involvement of the private sector into the national S&T and innovation enterprise.
Right.
This is not, I'm not making a doctrinaire argument that the private sector is evil. Certainly the private sector has its own place in the economy as much as any other component of the polity does. The real difficulty is, if we are dealing with the private sector, what is the outcome public good that is envisaged in private sector partnerships? Now, many of my friends will say, you don't understand, one can actually have a win-win situation where the private sector makes money and yet the outcome is a social sector public good. I have skepticisms about this, but even granted this, the real difficulty is that overall, when you think about the private sector as a partner, what you're really thinking about is public good in terms of enhancing the performance of the economy and enhancing the quality of life for the underprivileged.
The document actually talks about benefits both in terms of economic growth and in terms of social good.
Absolutely.
But if there is no commensurate increase in state or public R&D expenditure, then it virtually says that it expects the social good to come out of the increased private sector investment. And what you're pointing to is the unlikelihood of that happening.
What I'm pointing to is that despite even well-meaning structural efforts to engineer public-private partnerships so as to simultaneously provide both, success rates in that kind of enterprise are going to be low enough that what we are really going to end up with is an over-dominant model that says that the economic performance of S&T and innovation output is really what we are counting as success. And once that happens, given the fact that S&T and innovation, even when they come into the marketplace as improvements of the economy, are very frequently low job creators. the likelihood that trickle-down social improvement will or social good will happen becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point that I am deeply concerned about this. Let me add something to this. Clearly, it has become apparent, not simply to outsiders like us, but even within the corridors of power, that in order to deliver genuine social good, the involvement of the state in domains downstream of actual innovation, into innovation delivery, be it in the manufacturing sector, be it in extension, be it in a range of interventions, state interventions in downstream steps and components is absolutely essential.
Sure.
This document does not reflect that practical wisdom.
There is only a passing reference to involvement of NGOs in delivery, and particularly in rural technology, which I think is scratching the surface.
That's a very limited and an extremely sector-specific small component.
Okay.
The overall acknowledgement simply doesn't.
Let me ask about the other indicators that the policy document says to measure how we will step up the role of science and technology innovation in our country. It talks of increasing the global share of publications in S&T from 3.5% to 5%, that's doubling. It talks of quadrupling the contribution, the number of papers from India in the top 1% of the journals, which, as you know, is an important index to measure the quality rather than the quantity. It talks of quadrupling those, and of course to raise the citation index of Indian publications to close to the global average, at least. However, if there is no substantial rise in investment or a reorientation or tackling of the institutional limitations of Indian research institutions, how are these going to be achieved?
So again, a number of levels of response I think would be interesting for this. One, you're right, of course. We are promising to do something, or at least hoping to do something explicitly, that is unlikely to be achievable. This in itself is not a bad thing, but let us all keep in mind soberly that it is unlikely to be achievable. Two, the document actually says in a couple of different places that in order to do this, both increase in public investment and alteration in organizational structural bottlenecks will be undertaken, but it does not specify anything very much on those scores. Now, one can hope that a follow-up of this will lead to that. But I would like to make a slightly deeper point about this. All of these become numerical substitutes in the field of science for what is perceived as that ambiguous notion called high quality science. Right. The problem with science is that its output is perceptible only to other scientists in the main. Now, if that is the case, then how are we judging the quality of the output? And all the parameters that you talked about are efforts to convert the perceptions of global scientific peers into numbers. Yes. And honestly, not simply in India, but globally, all these numbers generate are efforts on the part of the large majority of everyday routine scientific establishment membership to game the system. Right. Once you have a benchmark, systems begin to game the benchmark. Effectively, what we are promising is that we will game the benchmark. That's not really improving our science quality. What we need to do is to stop being lazy and actually to put ourselves in the position of being rigorously judged. One institution, one individual, one enterprise at a time, to the combined judgment of a global, extremely high quality peer group. in each area. This is not simple, but I don't think that numbers are an adequate substitute.
So let me come back to a slightly more general consideration of this to conclude this discussion. The assumption is that we had a science policy, then we had a technology policy, and now we are going to the next level, and that's innovation, which means combining our science and technology to deliver something which would make a mark in the economy and for society. However, if we have not achieved what we set out to do in basic research, if we have not achieved what we set out to do in technological development, what are the chances of being able to achieve or promote a culture of innovation in our country?
In order to answer that, let me make a plug for the document. So far, I have been arguing against it. There are some things in the document that are extremely salutary and sobering acknowledgements, as well as some interesting ones. So the fact that we have a human resource capacity problem, we have a structural capacity problem, we have an investment capacity problem, these are acknowledged in the document, which I think is welcome, certainly. But here's something else that there is in the document that's interesting. And the document says that what we will promote is high quality, high risk efforts. This is an interesting departure. When we speak of innovation, what we are really talking about is taking calculated high risks, both in the science sector and in the technology development sector. Delivery of technology is a whole different arena altogether, but in these science and technology upstream regions, calculated high risks are an interesting proposition that the document proposes. Really, the question is, are we going to follow Western models? Western, I say simply because that's our current yardstick of success. Western models of how to do science, how to do technology development, or are we going to use our limitations and convert them into strengths such that we will come up with high-risk questions, with high-risk approaches that are unique as emergent from our situations, circumstances, strengths, limitations put together, that will provide a completely different kind of science and technology. And if we can do that, then we will have genuinely bypassed or leapfrogged. If we can't do that, and the document, while it pays lip service to this notion, provides no strategic ideas about how to do that. And if we can't do that, we are not going to foster an independent sense and culture of evolution, of innovation. Really, the difficulty is our culture of innovation simply a Me Too culture of innovation, or is it a culture of a different kind of innovation? And that's a sense that the document begins to go towards and then perhaps stops itself from going all the way into.
Let me ask you a last question just to conclude, and that is the process by which this document came about. It seems to have been, to put it mildly, sprung on the nation from the Science Congress. Would it not have been more useful to have had this document come out of a larger dialogue with the scientific community and with other stakeholders in science and technology progress and development in this country?
Well, the short answer, of course, is yes. There are, I can imagine, the administrators charged with creating the document wailing and gnashing their teeth in the outer darkness, saying, you have no idea of the kind of practical problems we have when we put these documents together, and I sympathize with that as well. Nonetheless, would it be useful to iterate such documents in the public domain?
That's right.
Of course it would. And not to iterate it is, it is not my case that iterations are necessarily going to lead to monumental improvements.
But at least.
But that should not prevent us from entering into transparent processes of giving opportunities for multiple stakeholders at many levels to be heard over prolonged periods of time. We are a large and diverse country with many inequalities. We take time for doing many things, and we use that as the justification, or at least as explanation, for why we take time to do many other things. Why not this?
So let us at least take the opportunity to maybe sit together after a year or two and iterate this document and our experience of science, technology and innovation policy.
It would be a very interesting exercise.
Thank you, Satyajit.
Thank you.